Joseph was a dreamer. God spoke to him in dreams. God warned him in dreams. And Joseph listened to God in those dreams. And because Joseph was faithful to God's call in his life, he brought his family to safety in Egypt. Okay, who am I talking about? Joseph, the patriarch, right? Of course. But I was very precise with my language here. And in that precision, I was also speaking about another Joseph. Joseph, the husband of Mary, and the adopted father of Jesus, right? Joseph was a dreamer. God spoke to him in dreams. God warned him in dreams. And Joseph listened to God in those dreams. And because Joseph was faithful to God's call in his life, he brought his family to safety in Egypt. Two Josephs, separated by 1,800 years or so, and their stories echo each other with remarkable attention to detail. Now, all of those details that I just mentioned about the New Testament Joseph are all and only found in the Gospel of Matthew. It's only in Matthew's Gospel that we learn that God spoke to Joseph in dreams and warned him to take the family off to Egypt. So Matthew is commonly referred to by biblical scholars as the most Jewish of the Gospels. In the late first century, there were Gentile Christians and there were Jewish Christians, and Matthew's Gospel seems to be written to speak about Jesus specifically to Jews who might come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. We think that Matthew was written somewhere around 80, 85, maybe even as late as 90 BC. And we think that Matthew was writing in Syria for his community there. Why Syria? Well, because in 70 AD, the Roman Empire had utterly destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, and many Jews and Christians then fled the Holy Land. Many of those refugees sought asylum in Syria. We know that the Jews and the Jewish Christians in Syria had a lot of interaction, and it wasn't all good. Some were blaming the heresy of the Christians, believing that Jesus was God, for God's punishment of Jerusalem by the hand of the Romans. The Christians used the opportunity in exile to try and convince their Jewish friends and relations to accept Jesus as part of the grand story of God. Matthew's gospel seems to have been written to do exactly this, to demonstrate to the Jewish exiles in Syria that Jesus was a part of God's plan all along. And Matthew does this overtly in the opening chapters of his gospel. Matthew shows a man named Joseph whom God spoke to in dreams, just like his patriarchal namesake had 1,800 years prior. Matthew shows Joseph warned by God in this dream to take Jesus and Mary to safety in Egypt, just like the Joseph of Genesis would do for his family to provide safety from the famine. Matthew shows that the danger that Jesus was in was from King Herod, who wanted to kill Jesus out of fear, and in order to do this, ordered the murder of all the male children of the region. This, of course, lines up almost perfectly with the Pharaoh that hundreds and hundreds of years earlier ordered the murder of all the male children of the Israelites in order that another child named Moses would survive from. Matthew then shows how God speaks to Joseph again in a dream, telling him that the coast is clear and that they can return. And so Jesus, Mary, and Joseph then return from Egypt, making their own mini Exodus journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus' inaugural act of ministry is when he climbs a mountain and gives the Sermon on the Mount, just like the first thing that Moses does after the people have come through the Red Sea is he climbs a mountain to commune with God and receive the Ten Commandments. Matthew clearly and overtly presents Jesus as a new Moses. And Matthew presents the early part of Jesus' life and ministry as a reenactment of the Exodus. Just like in the first Exodus, God saved and redeemed his people from slavery and brought them into a new land to call home. In Jesus, God saves and redeems all humanity from slavery to sin and death and brings us to everlasting life in the kingdom of heaven. You can see why Matthew's gospel would have been an effective tool for an evangelism for a Jewish Christian church to speak to a Jewish audience in Syria who were looking for answers as to what God was up to in a world that seemed to have been just turned upside down. And you can see how this message would have been kicked off by a man named Joseph, who echoed the life of another Joseph from long, long ago. This Christmas, as we hear the familiar story of Jesus' birth, and we're invited to the manger with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, don't forget Joseph there. Obviously, the focus of the manger is on Jesus, but don't just discount Joseph. And remember his long-lost cousin, who had a fancy coat, and who heard the voice of God resound in his dreams. Dreams of redemption and dreams of salvation.